have a very educational, these formulas look very familiar to me. We have, I can find.
So I'm Doug Bilsey. I'm the senior engineer. And this item has to do with a response to a request that you had made last meeting. And we promised to come back and talk about levels of service, as it's a key component of a lot of the things that we do. This is just informational, so feel free to ask questions as we go. It's somewhat educational and by design. So I think it'd be okay if you have questions as we go. So the Highway Capacity Manual is an industry standard for establishing level of service methods and performance measures. The General Plan Mobility element requires traffic evaluations to be consistent with the Highway Capacity Manual. So the Highway Capacity Manual essentially uses two different performance measures. There's some other performance measures, but the ones that we specifically do is level of service, which is a qualitative evaluation of a driver's experience, and capacity, which is a quantitative evaluation of the road's ability to meet anticipated traffic. And just so you know, most of this, as best I could, I wanted to reference the Highway Capacity Manual or similar documentation. Then I tried to make it more easy to understand, but these are all very directly taken from documents. I just didn't put references in my report because I didn't quote things, but I tried to put them in vernacular that you could understand. But they are very directly tied to references. So the basics of the level of service, it's typically based on a weekday, and it reflects peak hours, which is the AM and the PM commute hours. You're given a letter grade, although in class I never got an E. I never got an F, but I never got an E. But there is an E, and there's actually a G and an H. So the G and the H are new, and that reflects how long you are at level of service F. So if it's more than 15 minutes or 20 minutes, you can get worse than an F. Wow. Carlsbad standard is a level of service D. That means that if we report levels of service E or F on a facility, they are termed deficient. So there's a correlation, and when you try to use words, I kind of want to point out how vague these words are. And there's just a blur between an A and a B and a C and a D, but it's pretty clear when you get to E and F. So when you're talking about A, it's a little delay. B, you begin to get restricted in the speed you choose. C and D it's the difference between acceptable delay and tolerable delay. And yes, they are very slight, but if we get beyond that, really what you do is you want to define, because level of service D is our standard, it's okay to have a D, which is tolerable delay, but it is not acceptable to have E, which is stop and go conditions for short periods, and then when you get to failure, which is queues backed up from the downstream restrictions. So that's a solid line between D and E. So level of service analysis, just to kind of give you an idea, there's a difference between being accurate and being precise. So if you look at the left, you can see that the person's pretty accurate. They're aiming at the right place. They don't quite have the precision on the left, but then on the precision on the right, you have someone that's dialed in, but they're just off target a little bit. And these will probably make sense as we take some examples. So when you look at the levels of analysis and you look at an operational analysis, you want a very high level of detail. You don't use many default values, and you want a high amount of precision. The design is somewhere in between, and that's usually used for a needs assessment. And then the planning and preliminary design analysis, a lot of defaults can be used. It's useful for things like monitoring, and you get very accurate, but you don't get very precise. So if I had arrows, I'd say as you go down that list, your accuracy goes up and your precision somewhat goes down. So this is a comment that's been made by commissioners. This default values, and I wanted to walk you through that. So sometimes you'll see a daily analysis, and that kind of conflicts with something that I just said, that all analysis is done in the peak hour. Well, you really don't do a daily analysis, but you take a daily number and you convert it to a peak 15-minute period. So you go from a peak hour, you say, well, what percentage of traffic happens in the peak hour? And you can either measure it, in which case you wouldn't use daily, you would actually use the peak hour volume, or you get a factor. And then once you have a two-way directional peak hour volume, you do a directional factor and you either guess or you go out and collect the data in the field and say it's 60% one direction, 40% another, and you actually know it instead of doing a default value. And then the peak hour, you say how much higher is the peak 15 minutes than the rest of the peak hour, and that's what you come up with the volume that you do analyze. So let's give you two examples. One is we take 35,000 and we say the K factor. When you look at there's dozens of factors in all this level of service, but these are very critical and you'll see why. The K factor is percent of daily traffic, which would be 9%. Then it goes from 35,000 to 3,100. Then you say a D, which is a directional split, you say 60-40. So the main direction is getting 60% of traffic, the other 40. You just worry about the main traffic, which is 60%. Now your volume goes down to 1903 or 1900 for one direction. And now you say, well, you know, the peak 15 minutes is a little bit higher, 3% higher than the other 45 minutes of the peak hour, and you end up with the 1958. You can just as easily see factors that are a little different, and the results being significant. So you can have a K factor of 10%. So instead of 9%, you go 10%. You can see that's a big difference between that and a directional factor of 0.7 to 0.6. So instead of saying it's 60-40, you say, well, it's more 70-30 for whatever reason. You get a much higher number here, a 2,400 in one direction as opposed to 1,900. And then even at that point when you say, well, the peak hour factor or the 15 minutes is a little bit higher, that's a little bit lower than this one, you could see you end up with a much higher number. They could be in any range or even a larger range than this in default values. So using default parameters. Use field data as much as possible. You don't rely on default parameters if you have the actual data. But sometimes it's not available. Sometimes gathering the data is very expensive. And sometimes it's not even possible to collect data for, let's say, a new development. When Robertson Ranch went in, we didn't have any data of the before, so we had to guess a lot of the data or the future. So if you look out 20 years, I've done a lot of projects where there was just nothing out there in almost the size of a city. So using all default parameters sometimes is required. So here we start getting a little technical, and I am going to try not to lose you here. So hang on and ask questions as you need to get through this. This is a little bit complex graph, but it tells you a lot. So if you were to drive the speed limit or the target speed, you would travel through this intersection at T1. But most of the time you can't travel the speed limit on a major road in the peak hour, in the peak 15 minutes. So you end up driving at what's called the running speed, which is a little bit slower. So the slope of this line is the speed that you're traveling. And so with trucks and not being able to switch lanes freely, short of Chuck in his BMW, you're going to have a little bit slower travel along the corridor. And you'll arrive, or you'll go through the intersection. Actually, T0 is when you would get through the intersection because we haven't even looked at a signal yet. And if you were to drive through a long corridor without any signals, you would get there at T1. Well, every time you go through an intersection, you have this delay. You have to decelerate, you have to wait for the light to turn green, and you have to accelerate before you travel through the intersection at a new speed. So what we have here is controlled delay, the delay that was related to the signal, and that's intersection level of service related. And then you have segment delay, which really hits the whole gamut for why you can't drive the speed limit from your house to work and never stop. So let's start with segment delay. And I'm going to go off this diagram. If anybody wants to talk about the graph, feel free to ask questions. So now when we go to roadway segment level service analysis, going back to what we just learned, it's accurate but not precise. It's based on vehicle speed. It includes signal timing delay, and it's recommended when signalized intersections are spaced less than 2 miles apart. So whenever you see a signalized arterial being analyzed, it's a good recommendation to do the roadway segment level of service and as needed in intersection analysis on top of that. But the roadway segment does include intersection delay to a certain extent. For a roadway segment, it's really simple to gather the data. You put a tube down, or you collect it. Well, we'll talk about that, but you can collect it with automatically with the tubes or with the advanced loops that we have. But it's really a pretty simple process. You put out a tube, and you gather it for days or weeks or months, or constantly if you want. That's all it takes. Is just that count in one direction or each direction. So these service volume tables that we developed, and we go into details about that, but this is basically the new approach is that we have had a consultant come in and develop this table for each street. So for El Camino Real, for each section, each one of these sections, and you could see in the staff report, it goes into a little bit detail, but you can't just say El Camino Real from its whole extent is the same and constant character. So we broke it up into similar characters and or characteristics. So for each area, it has the service volumes, and I'll get into the asterisks and the pound signs, but for an ability to, you grab the volume, you look up here for the peak hour, and you're done. It's pretty easy. It's very simplistic. It's very direct and accurate, but not precise. So part of that precision comes into these stars and asterisks. The stars essentially mean that the signals are spaced so closely together that you're not likely to get level of service A or B in the peak hour regardless of the volume. I mean, it's just not going to run very good because your signals are spaced so close together, and when you look at that graph, you're just stopping for pedestrians, whatnot. The pound sign, I didn't even want to get into the graph, but I think everybody would agree that as congestion increases, it's not linear. It's not that you continuously go down in volume or go down in speed. It hits like a wall. You can see that on a freeway. You get what's called a shock wave. Is you'll be going the speed until you hit congestion. And when you hit congestion, it's harsh and it's fast. And so these are more indicative of spaced signals that are far spaced. And you really never see a D or an E. It doesn't hit you. It's just a wall. And when it hits hard. So this is all space or speed based. So a little background on that. So now let's talk about control delay. So that's a little part of the road segment, but it goes in much more detail than what the road segment does. This is a diagram of the intersection. You could see you have 8 different movements or phases, and they're all fighting for green time. So at best, you can have 2 of these phases operating at any one time. So really, when you look at it, you have eight phases, and at best, you have 4 different pairs moving. So if you get a green 25% of the time, you're doing okay. So that means 1 out of 4 cars getting a green is expected. And the better job we do, we get it much better than that, but it really is a limited resources and more people wanting the green light than you can possibly give them. It's very expensive to collect data for an intersection analysis, so this is very typical. You have a hired consultant or staff person sit on the corner and they are actually counting. This is a little manual counter, and they watch the cars go through. Sometimes the intersection of PAR and ECR, for instance, is so big you need 2 people to do it. You typically do not go out there for a whole day. You go out for a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the peak, and you're done. You really don't do off-peak. You don't do weekends. I think I implied it, but if it wasn't clear, with a tube count, you could do weekends, you could do special events, you could do 4th of July, anything you want. You can get the data very, very easily. Very hard to coordinate the turning movements for the hour that Legoland is let out after fireworks. But this is, the tubes are pretty easy. So intersection level service analysis does not include the delay traveling between intersections. It's just the intersection. Then there's generally 2 methods, at least that we'll be talking about. The intersection capacity utilization, or ICU, and then the HCM method. The 2 methods side-by-side comparison, the ICU is good for planning purposes. It's accurate. It's independent of the timing plan. So regardless of how well I do a timing plan, the ICU will give out the same result. It uses volume to evaluate how close you are to capacity. So that actually is a very good tool when you're working with developers and telling them what their nexus is, and when you're doing traffic impact fees to say what percentage is your responsibility. The HCM method is good for operations. It's very precise, so you can do timing plans with the HCM. It evaluates the timing plans, and it uses delay to estimate or reflect the driver's experience. But it doesn't really tell you how close you are to the delay or the problems. It just tells you exactly where you are. It's very precise, and it tells you right where you are, but it doesn't allow you to plan very well. Hope that makes sense. So going back to our diagram.
Based on Pio Pico Drive toward Carlsbad Village Drive, then turn left on Carlsbad Village Drive.
So here's our diagram.
Just use the words.
Yeah, that's it. That's good. So this is the diagram with the 8 phases, and not to get deep. So I really, I've done this for a long time, so I hope I don't get into the weeds too much, but you have the phases kind of laid out here, and the ICU method kind of says, okay, one of these on the top or the bottom is more critical than the other. And it takes the critical pair here and the critical pair there, and it says how close are you to capacity on this end and how close are you to capacity on that end. You add the 2 up, and that's your volume or your capacity, how close you are to capacity. And that's pretty straightforward. Once you have the volumes, you're done. It doesn't take into consideration as much the pedestrian impact. So you have to be a little careful about that, because really pedestrians, they don't show up every intersection, but when they do, your level of service degrades tremendously. It really is a whole different level of service, so won't go into details on that. So now the HCM method, you get to learn about Webster's equation. Looks pretty simple because you have to start out with a very simple equation. You get a D1 plus D2 plus D3. Looks pretty easy. D1's average delay per vehicle with uniform arrival, so the signals are coordinated and you're coming in on the green. D2 is the average delay per vehicle due to random arrivals, when you have a right turn from the upstream intersection. And then D3 is a term we'll get to in a little bit, but it's the average delay per vehicle due to initial queue at start of the analysis time period. So that is really a relatively new thing that we kind of realized in the industry, that sometimes it's just so congested, it's metered traffic or there's a lot of different terms, but it's so congested that there's some residual queue that goes on. Those are the terms that are used. And then you have a progression factor adjustment. This is something that's very precise. How well do you have your signals coordinated? It's very precise, but it's very inaccurate, because we just say, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. So it's very, very precise, very, very inaccurate. We don't have anything that really guides us on what that factor should be other than professional judgment. So there's D1 for an idea of just this one term is here. X is an equation, and I can go into that, but you don't really want to get there. And then D2 is another big complicated equation. What X is an equation on top of that, and K and I and T. I'm sure I can impress all of you with that, but suffice to say that this is really conducive to software. So very few people actually do this by hand. So you buy a software and sometimes you even simulate, and we could talk about that a little bit later. When you get the software, you have this complex time-space diagram, and you don't have to learn this, but there are parts to it for D1, which means when the light turns green, those are uniform arrivals at the downstream. And then this is when the side street, someone takes a right turn on red, and then they come into there. So don't worry about that, but there is some D1 or D2, but that residual Q would not be shown in this software. So how do you collect D3 and determine a platoon factor or progression factor? Well, this person out on the corner needs to be observant or start their analysis way in advance of the traffic congestion happening, and they have to stay there until the congestion's done. Otherwise, you have this delay that hasn't gone anywhere. And there really isn't a way for that person to determine the progression factor. So the software will give you some defaults, very precise, but very inaccurate. So sometimes a really well-trained person here could take field notes and determine D1 and progression factors. Capacity. There's a lot of talk, and one of the TSC commissioners has brought this up, and the term, I want to make sure we're really clear on the term. The capacity is the maximum mid-block traffic flow without consideration of the impact of the downstream traffic signal. That is what it is there and intended to do. It's used to determine if the roadway facility has an adequate number of through lanes. I think we'd all agree that very few times we're traveling between intersections that we have concerns about the number of lanes. It's only at the intersections, and usually the number of lanes are so many because you don't merge down in between intersections and then add lanes at the intersections. But if it does happen, the capacity needs to be determined. It's usually not the driving point. It is the driving point on a freeway and a highway, an unsignalized highway where you go miles without a traffic signal. So the capacity does play a role in level of service in those, but as I noted before, if you have a signalized arterial and it has a signal within 2 miles spacing, you should be doing a roadway segment analysis and not a capacity analysis. So it's not intended for level of service of a signalized arterial. It's used, and if your capacity is exceeded, if your volume or your demand exceeds capacity, it's automatically determined to be F. But that rarely happens. So really the capacity is not as important as the service volume. The service volumes are much lower. Just because graphs are a little bit easier to talk about, there is a capacity ratio, which is volume to capacity ratio, and this is a diagram from the freeway section. So if you don't have signalized intersections, you do get a level of service for that, but one of the problems is when you come up with a volume to capacity ratio, you could be at this point, or that point. So you could be at level of service F, E, or D even, depending on the speed. So the problem is that the volume to capacity ratio really isn't speed sensitive. So you don't have to worry about this, but there is a speed sensitive solution. It is not volume to capacity, it gets to density. Don't worry about it, but just if you want to go down the capacity path, we can talk more about it, but it really is about freeways and highways. It's not about signalized corridors. So just a little bit, this is a picture of Highway 68 in Monterey County. And I don't know how much to go too much into this, but we were part of a study done by Rick Dowling and Associates, and it ended up being a critical part of the Highway Capacity Manual So this was done, gosh, 25 years ago when I was starting out in the field. And we did a really interesting thing that we noticed that at this first intersection, this queue was back maybe a half an hour. People were taking about 20 minutes to get to this first intersection, and they take about 15 minutes to get to this intersection off a Highway 1. But nowhere did it fail, because everybody here, if the floodgates were open, you would get a failure here, and this number 800 would be more likely maybe 900 or 1,000. And likewise here, we would have metered flow. That's where the metered flow kind of came in, and you started getting residual cues. So what Dowling did, they were so interested in this, they came back another time and they actually flew a helicopter for hours to actually, and if you look at that Webster's equation, it's all estimates and equations. They actually flew a helicopter and looked at every single car. They had, I'm sure interns do it for hours and days and days. They looked at every car, every delay, and that's somewhat where the D2 and the D3 terms came about, from Rick Dowling and associates specifically. He's kind of the leader in this whole talk. And it led to service flow rates, which was actually, or it pointed him to service flow rates were being done in Florida at the FDOT, Department of Transportation. And it took a long time for the HCM to embrace it, but now the service flows are in there. They've been around a long time, but they are relatively new to the Highway Capacity Manual. So, we're almost done. What's next? The Growth Management Monitoring Report that we just did will reflect the new level of service approach with the service volume tables. Staff is studying ways to gather data automatically as part of the adaptive traffic signal program. So our loops and our, actually we think we can get somewhat accurate turning movements, or we need that for adaptive. They may not be good enough for legally defensible, but they're good for adaptive. We think they might be good enough for monitoring purposes to get this data automated. And our adaptive signal collectors will, and I could go into that another time, but we think we're going to have some good data to capture progression adjustment factor. It's not a factor specifically calculated, but we will be working with the vendor, and maybe we can have them put in something that would actually be a factor. But for now, we have data that'll come out. It's called high resolution data, and it'll give us something to hang our hat on. Other than 2 out of the 3 engineers that talked about it thought we did a great job, and the peak hour, the progression factor should be 4 instead of 3. So changes will be made and documented as necessary based on the feedback as we use it. Now, to give Commissioner Linke some credit on this, I don't want to confuse the commissioners with new or competing graphs, but suffice to say, I think this does a pretty good job of showing what used to be done, which was capacity-related level of service, which is, again, more for freeways and highways. So when the capacity level of service was done, you were in these ranges for A, B, A and C, let's say good flows are green. D is yellow, your cautionary, and then E is fail or is deficient, and F is failing. So the old way with an 1,800 capacity approach, this was done, and these are different approaches at different service volumes, but generally they line up pretty close to being way to the left of the 1,800 capacity. So the level of service threshold for E is much lower, and as a result, we anticipate lower levels of service. This is just the mid-block counts, but also at the intersection too. We can go into detail on that, but the new approaches with the Highway Capacity Manual are expected to show 1 or 2 levels of service, in some cases lower. So if you have any questions.
Commissioner questions. Commissioner Linke.
So could you go back to the bar charts? So this to me is the most clear way to show it for laypersons who aren't necessarily experts in the area. The top bar chart shows the method that Carlsbad has used for the past 30 years that I talked about a lot last month. And just to be clear, I think in an earlier slide, Mr. Bilsey showed how it comes back around. There were 3 different points. In other words, when you get up to a certain number of cars, they start slowing down and you come back down in the number of vehicles that can go by. You know which one I'm talking about?
I'll get there. Hold on a second.
So what happens with the Carlsbad method is that the street gets so congested that you can never get a grade that's probably worse than C. If you looked at my chart, they set the capacity as if every lane in Carlsbad were a freeway lane, where there's no ramps, no nothing. It's just like put 2 lines down on a completely flat, straight surface, see how many cars can go by there at rapid speed. So what happens is, in our streets, you probably get up to C, and then that curve starts going back down. So it's like it's designed to never fail. Does everyone kind of understand what that means? And that's why I think we need to change it. The intersection method, this was something that's called ICU. This is something that Southern California cities started using back in the, I think, the 80s when we did it. But for some reason, Carlsbad chose a default value for how many cars can go in each lane, in each through lane, as 2,000 cars can go in each through lane. But other jurisdictions all chose much more reasonable values that were recommended by the ICU people at the time, like 1,600. So again, the intersection analysis was designed so that it basically could never fail, and it's just, the data is not real, it's fake data. And I think what we've seen here confirms that. Could you go to the table that I had at the end? So this just shows you, we've had our growth management program requires us to monitor traffic every year for the past 30 years. Since 1989 we've done it. And every year it's A's and a few B's with the mid-block. The ICU method for the intersection sometimes goes down to C. It has failed on a very, very small number of occasions, but they're designed not to fail. And you can see that if you apply a valid method, the column of letters on the right is the reality versus all those A's you see on the left. It's just completely fake data. So after 8 years of me complaining about this, I'm very pleased that Mr. Bilsey has taken the first step here to fix this. So I'm wondering, Mr. Bilsey, do you agree with what I just said about how misleading the current data is? I know you might not want to answer that question, but.
Well, I think I fully support the upgrades and the updating of the system. It hasn't been updated since it was originated, so it's time to update it.
Are either of those methods, the Carlsbad ICU intersection method or the mid-block segment method, are either of those consistent with the highway capacity manual?
The ICU specifically is not called out for in the highway capacity manual, so we decided to go with the HCM method and not the ICU, so that's not consistent with it. And
the service volume tables, I understand, were created based on the highway capacity manual, so
yes.
that cannot, so our current method also cannot be consistent with the highway capacity manual.
Well, again, the capacity level of service was consistent with it, but I think the application was between signals, and my direction, or at least my understanding of HCM, is that you should use service flow rates as opposed to capacity.
Right, if you want to advise decision makers, if you want to advise this advisory committee or the city council as decision makers, if you present them with data on level of service using the current Carlsbad mid-block method, would that be any bit meaningful to them?
It wouldn't be as good as the new method being approached, so I think
so I think we got the point.
Okay.
That we're gonna move on from the old and look to a brighter, happier future. And we're very happy that you have taken the step to start the process. And the same with Commissioner Linke, that we got the first step going, and then we can go from here,
Okay, so I'd like to make a motion.
okay?
I'd like to pass it out so everybody has a copy of it because it's rather complex. The director of plants at our last meeting said that the changes would occur maybe over the next year, but I think this is such a high priority thing. We've also had a problem getting our work plan developed, so my motion is related to both of those. And it is, as the commission responsible for advising the city council on implementation of the general plan mobility element, the Traffic Safety Commission has determined that staff has not consistently been conducting level of service analyses based on the highway capacity manual as required by the general plan mobility element. Due to staff delays in assisting the Traffic Safety Commission in the development of its work plan, the Traffic Safety Commission requests that the city council approve a preliminary work plan while a full work plan is being developed as follows. Establish standards for level of service analysis conducted by and for the city with the following objectives. 1, review work by staff for public review and formal approval of level of service analysis guidance documents. 2, review work by staff to develop training materials for other commissions and the city council for level of service review. 3, work with staff to develop a formal public review process for level of service analyses conducted on projects not reviewed by other commissions or other bodies. And 4, work with staff to identify when intersection level of service should be conducted for the growth management plan monitoring program and in transportation impact analysis guidelines. So I think this is extremely important that this proceed with all haste because there are development projects that are going on. There are, our growth monitoring program is overdue to be submitted, and all those things need to use valid methods rather than invalid methods. So I'm just urging the commission to at least inquire with the city council whether to proceed to using valid methods.
I have a question for Mr. Vilsey. Based on your presentation, what are the next steps for staff in regard to the new LOS service?
Well, other than the work plan development, I think we're in the same position where we're developing our approach to it.
And do you have any time frame?
I believe Director Plant said it might take up to a year for the transition, but I don't think we're at a point right now where we can give you a timeline.
That's not what I said.
What did you say for the next? It was something in the minutes, but if you want to speak to it.
He said perhaps within the next year. That's
Perhaps,
correct.
okay.
So it concerns me that this could go on and on. Other things have gone on and on for months and years, and so I think we should, if people don't like this motion, I can make an alternative motion that just we were welcomed by Director Plants to, I think, consult with the city council to see whether our role falls in this area. I'm not, last month I proposed that we request that staff stop using it, and that was rejected, so now I'm requesting that we ask city council to take that action, which is their power to do that.
Okay. Let's clarify the motion from other commissioners' questions. Commissioner Hunter.
It's around the motion, but if I look at the table and assume that the letters on the right side are correct, or anywhere close to correct, and if we need to maintain a levels C service and above, we have failures across the board. How do we relate that to Planning Commission and the council, and assuming that they're even close to being correct? I mean, I've driven down Palomar Airport Road now, and we're still building at Bresci. We're putting condos in at Bresci. We just put in new shops at Bresci. We put in another hotel at Bresci. And when I crossed from Lowe's at El Camino Real the other day, I got across, and I stopped, and people behind me couldn't even get across because the traffic on PAR from that point forward was already there. So I mean, clearly we're a G or an H on something like that. So we brought in Robertson Ranch. We brought in a whole bunch of other things that, you know, if you're looking at that, we're just by our own guidelines, which is C or above, D or above, yeah. you still got lots of red E's and F's and G's and H's hiding in there someplace. I'm just, it's not sit around for another year and approve the planning commission's building more stuff, although we're pretty much out of space, so we're kind of in deep kimchi as it is, unless we put another lane in all those roads somewhere along the way. I'm just wondering what the plan of the process is. If you, based on what you said, which is you agree with Commissioner Linke that we need to change our methodology, and if our methodology puts us into E's and F's, where does that leave us? Complicated, not really complicated, long question, but.
That's why it's taking the time it takes to transition. It's not, we are required as part of the general plan to use the highway capacity manual, but it's not something we could do on a turn of a dime. So we need to coordinate and do things. Some things are outside of our purview, some of the things you mentioned. So the growth management program, we're monitoring that's changed over, and then there's so many other things that have to change, and they're in the mid-process. So I hope that answers your question.
No, not really. I mean, I know it takes time, and take Marshall jump in here.
Yep.
But essentially what I have, when I look at it, is the patient's bleeding. And we're sitting there gonna go, well, we're gonna analyze methodologies to cure his disease, which may come around in a year or two. And again, I'm not beating it up, we're all here together, but I'm just trying to understand, if we're already in trouble, shouldn't we do something?
So I'd like to maybe respond to that and some other comments that were made. So we are in a transition as far as how we are how we are assessing traffic performance in the city. And that doesn't mean that we don't have a valid system in place right now. We do have a valid system in place right now. We are using two systems, one to evaluate for CEQA purposes, and we're using a highway capacity manual intersection-based level of service analysis. And for the growth management plan performance, we are using the new roadway capacity tables. And it is true that, that those are two separate tools, but they are both valid and they are both being used at this time. So we're not in a lurch, we're not in a middle space in terms of having valid evaluation tools. We are in a middle ground as it relates to CEQA, and by that I mean that in the future the CEQA analysis is going to be going away from delay-based or intersection-based tools. It's going to go to vehicle miles traveled by a project by project assessment. Completely different way of looking at traffic impacts, and so that is something that is occurring over the next year, which I believe is what I was referring to maybe in the comment that Commissioner Linke was speaking to. So that is actually going on, and I think we have less than a year now at this time before
About
the cities need to convert to this new VMT, vehicle mile traveled CEQA analysis tool. In regard to the growth management plan, you're correct, there is an annual report that is prepared, and that report is being completed and will be distributed to the city manager for sharing with the city council. So until that happens, I think it's inappropriate for us to make any further comment about that. So there will be some information coming forward to the city council relative to the growth management plan standards, and there's one of the metrics is traffic. So that will be covered in there, and it is based on this tool that we are currently using to assess growth management plan performance, which is the roadway capacity tables, which is in part what Doug was speaking to you about this evening.
So that would be the methodology that tells them it's a level of service A on their growth management?
No, it's a methodology that evaluates the roadway capacity. The links that Doug was describing, it's no longer using the ICU method, which is the one that over the years has shown very high levels of service. So we have recognized, as required by the growth management, by the general plan mobility element, that we change our methodology. And so when the mobility element was approved in September of 2015, one of our tasks was to develop a new tool to reflect where we are in development in the city. That was a big lift, And Doug has done a fantastic job on that. He's been recognized regionally for his efforts in that regard, and we are now beginning to roll that out. So I just want to make clear that we have valid methods we're using currently. It's a little, it's a little more complicated because we have two different metrics we're evaluating. And to complicate it even further, one of those metrics is going to be changed entirely to go to the VMT in the future.
Okay, but there have been several projects that have been analyzed using those old methods as recently as a few months ago, using the old Carlsbad method.
I'm not familiar with what you're referring to, and I'm not sure about
At the last meeting,
that.
I mentioned at least 3 different projects, 3 different road diets that have been done
Right.
in the city of Carlsbad.
So those road diets, excuse me,
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
those road diet projects that were brought forward by the city, capital projects, were evaluated using the tools in place at the time. We had still not adopted these roadway capacity tables. We now have, and those are being used for growth management purposes, for the CEQA analysis and for the level of service analysis, including road diets. We still are relying on the HCM. We can support it with the roadway capacity tables. So I guess I think it's a matter of timing. So maybe this is the comment I may have made before, that we're in this transition period. So we are indeed in a transition period, but I don't believe that we have in any case used an old outdated method that had not already been replaced by a new methodology.
Okay, but the mobility element was adopted in September of 2015.
Correct.
We all agree with that.
Yep.
And all the project, in the mobility element, it says level of service needs to be determined by a highway capacity manual.
Yep.
And all the projects I mentioned were analyzed by methods that were not consistent with the highway capacity manual. They were analyzed with old Carlsbad methods that gave them all A's.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that. I mean,
Well,
we're just going to repeat the same
That's just the
same
truth.
story
So
back and forth. So
I don't know how we can continue to violate the general plan and not do anything about it. I guess I think we need, if people don't agree with my motion, at the very least, I think we need to have some sort of communication with the city council to determine how we're gonna bring this into compliance with the general plan. Because to continue to operate outside the general plan is just not acceptable. And the projects that have already been done outside of that are not acceptable to me.
So the council is not aware of this discrepancy between the old way and the new way?
They have not been given results yet. We have the general plan monitoring report in development right now. And
when is that going to be given to them?
I think it's going to happen very soon. We're just doing the final reviews on it.
Soon means weeks, months, year?
I would say months.
Okay.
The other point is that over a year ago, we were supposed to take over implementation of the mobility element. And the things we're talking about, the roadway capacity tables, the transportation impact analysis guidelines, all these tools that are being developed are things that are in the mobility element. And we, as the commission that is supposed to be overseeing that, should be overseeing it. Meanwhile, staff is just doing it and probably changing it. Each development project that comes, each growth management monitoring program, things can change. I really think we need this out in the public so that the public can see what's going on. And that's sort of the goal here, is so let's make this public so that everyone understands and we as a commission are overseeing it.
Okay, do I have a second on the motion?
I'm not ready, maybe I would. Can I ask questions?
Yes, of course, please.
So I want to back up a little bit because you use the word tools and one of my favorite words. What are we talking here? Are we talking some guy with a slide rule? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it commercial software? What are these tools?
Well, if I could, maybe.
I mean.
Yeah, echoing what Marshall said. I mean, we review stuff, and as of today, We review it to make sure that the software and the analysis and the tools are all consistent with the highway capacity manual.
Right.
So
I'm
we
not
have
even
converted to that.
asking things like that. What is it commercial software that we are using?
Well, the main thing is the attachment that I put in the staff report, the service table. We call it the roadway capacity table, but I
Is
think,
that
yes.
thing? Okay.
Well,
Uh,
the other table, and then the other one's a software. And it's just a matter of
But what's
using
a
a,
table, but there's also,
intersections are software-based, service tables are for the corridor, the signalized roadway.
so does that mean that the tables are simply data tables?
Yes.
And then the software are the things that calculate?
Yes, and then there's some guidance we're developing
Right.
to drive
Is
the
that commercial
development.
software, or is it a spreadsheet you created, or is it?
Commercial. It's Synchro, and you'll see another attachment that I have results from Synchro. So that's the industry standard. Then
Okay.
that's the thing we use for level of service, at least our group does.
Now,
Yes.
and that's what we should be using moving forward.
Yes.
Okay. And how long have you had that?
Well, we've had the software a long time, but we just started
Okay, but so
using
it's
it
not-
the last,
So we're not like, it's not a training issue or understanding how the software works or
No.
anything like that? Okay. And so, so now let's turn to the data. And so with regard to the new methods, we see, as you demonstrated, how hard it is, or easy it is, depending upon context, to collect data. So where does that stand? Do we have all the data we need to create the plans as they should be in best practice, let's say?
I'd say the application, I don't want to get into the details
Yeah,
of
sure.
that, but I'm developing a manual, a evaluation and monitoring manual, which will guide, because there's still some judgment that has to be done. As anything, it's not, foolproof. So there is some guidance that needs to be done, but that would be a very fine adjustment to levels of service. But I think they're important so that we have a uniformity in approach.
Sure.
And that may take a little bit of time. We have a contract to get that developed, and we're near the end of that on getting a draft.
Is that done by a third party? Or
Yes.
A consultant?
Yes, and so were the service tables. That was all done by a third party.
Okay, got it. And then the final question, thankfully, how long has it typically taken to create a complete report of capacity or of level of service, let's say? Is it when you're from the point at which you say we got to do this to, yes, this is the result that we want to, is it 6 months? Is it 3 months? Can you do it in a week if it were an extremis?
I want to make sure I get it right, because the one thing is a lot of our projects and development reviews are process driven, and the point where it starts, you set up a scope of work, and they're obligated to kind of use the tools in place at that point. So if a project came in today, they would be able to implement this fairly easy and very quickly.
Okay. And so is updating the general plan or the mobility element, this is quite a bit more complex than that, or?
I'm sorry.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is, and I understand software development, I understand processes and things like that, just from my professional background. I can't tell you how all this sort of hangs together. But I'm trying to get a feel for why, at this point where we have the software and we have experience with it, the data, it looks pretty good. We're not 100% there, but and so forth. So what are the barriers to just saying, okay, so we're ready to go, and there's nothing, there's no data problem, there's no software problem or anything like that. What are the barriers? Is it just everybody's busy doing a lot of different things, or what's the barrier?
We don't really have a barrier on applying it. It's you can tell that, like, the ramifications of a change in level of service with the growth management program is very important. So it's more of a process of how to get that information out and make sure everybody warms up to it and understands it, because it is a drastic change.
Okay, so somehow everybody's got to be warned that it's coming, and we have to be braced for that idea. It's part of the thing. Okay, that's
Yes.
fair enough. I accept that. So I definitely think that we have to do something to meet our obligations as commissioners and the commission. I'm not sure where that is, and so I think we have to do something along the line of your motion, and I'm not sure it needs to be as detailed as this. But I totally agree that we should operate at a level that we could be the first people start yelling, hey, this really needs to be changed. But more than just that sort of messaging from us, I'm not sure, because I understand there are problems, and I want to support staff in this, and they have a vision of how to move forward with the new software and things. So I'm maybe looking for some middle ground in this, but definitely I feel obligated to vote yes on something that moves this forward as rapidly as possible. And maybe something as simple as bringing this down into a very simple resolution of some kind, maybe 2 or 3 bullet points or something like that. I'm not sure. So that's where I'm at in this. But if there's a consensus with regards to his motion, then maybe that's what we need to do. And so I guess that's my opinion.
Do we have any other comments?
This is a very complex topic, and I understand where you're coming from, and as well as you. From a general public's point of view, though, there's a huge disparity between those A's and F's, and I live in some of those F's. For the public's good and the council's point of view, I think we need to give them the most accurate information that we can. And whether we give a deadline or whatever, as Chuck put it, the victim is bleeding. So, Steve, if you want to modify something, or go ahead.
So I agree with everything that was said. I do believe that, and I feel personally that I would like to give staff a chance. Again, I do understand where you're coming from and the frustration to get here. If staff would have started 8 years ago and didn't get here, it would be a little bit more of, and even then, I feel like, especially for us as a commission, it's just, this is a very new thing, and it hit us really fast. And I'm not sure that we are ready to make such a stand to ask staff overnight to, because we have to think about it, it's not just, it's true, the public does need accurate information, but we also have to think of political ramifications. I mean, there are more than just one aspect of how we're going to throw this out. We're going to put it out, but how we're going to put it out, right? It's not the message, it's how you deliver the message. So I would like to work with staff and the rest of the commissioners to come up with a motion that we, both parties, feel comfortable with, and taking consideration the big picture, not just putting out.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yes, please.
So the motion is not, like last month I said we should ask them nicely to stop using the methods, and that failed. And then I asked them to bring it back. This motion is just to ask the city council to put these items on our preliminary work, on a preliminary work plan. So it's not like I'm asking for them to change the methods. I'm just asking for us to ask the city council to approve a preliminary work plan where we will oversee the process. And that it would still take, it's still gonna take months probably to do it, but instead of it being done outside of the public eye, they will, it says that they will present us with the documents for our review, rather than them just doing what they want and then going directly to the city council or whatever it is their plan is. So it's a long motion, and I can modify it to make it simpler, but it's not one that's aggressively saying they need to do this right now. It's still gonna take, but however long it's gonna take, it's just that I'm asking for us to oversee it.
Kevin, hold on, the commissioners, Commissioner Hunter.
And kind of in that vein, but to the chairman's point, how we state things matters. And when we come in here and say, you know, the staff is not consistently, the staff is delaying stuff, that's an adversarial motion that says they're not doing something right, so we're gonna be in charge. And I don't think that's where most of us are at. I think it's we're all a team here together, and we're in the situation we're in. However we got there, and they're working to resolve it, we're working to resolve it, and we need to have a team-based system that gets us to that.
So if I cut off the entire first part and just start, the Traffic Safety Commission requests that the city council approve a preliminary work plan establishing standards for level of service analysis conducted by and for the city with the following objectives. If I cut off the entire first part of that, which you might view as the adversarial part, I could modify the motion in that way.
You know, if I'm, may I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So you said that before, and I thought, yes, that's exactly right. So, and in fact, though, I would also caution that the second thing is something that's going to be, that would possibly detract that is, and that is that this commission is going to oversee this process. And I'm guessing that that is not the expectation of what the city council would have us be doing. And it kind of depends on what you mean by overseeing the process. And so maybe that could be clarified, but I like the idea that a very simple 1 or 2 sentence motion that brings us to the attention of the city council and requests that that we start working on with staff at some level, or at least the staff work on it to move forward with this.
If I may interject, I think I have an issue with an overseeing. I think the advisory role of this commission is very well defined, and we should stick to that. And I think that's what defines where we go from here. The work plan is critical, and as the Commissioner Linke has suggested, it should be a priority, and that's our goal to, after consultation with the other commissions or staff with the other departments who have a piece of this pie. We're not seeing, we don't want a whole pie. We are just part of a bigger pie. With the advice from the city attorney's office to make sure we're not overstepping our boundaries, which will be pushed back and then thrown back in our face in a month or two. Said no, you should not have accepted or moved in that direction. I want to make sure what we do and where we go is acceptable to the city attorney's office first, and of course with the city council's ultimate goal and direction for this commission.
So with the knowledge that staff is probably sensitive to the word oversee or oversight, I used the word review. So just to review, so the point is that the documents, for example, the roadway capacity tables and the transportation impact analysis guidelines, whatever other the multimodal level of service point systems for pedestrians, bicycles, and transit, all of those things that are core elements in the mobility element, that we would review that, and we don't have to call it oversight, but just that we would review all of those level of service systems, because this is not just vehicles either, this is transit, pedestrian, and bicycles, All of those things have been developed by staff behind closed doors, and I'm not saying that it's all bad, but it should have a public review component, and we are the Traffic Safety Commission where the public is supposed to review these things. And I think the council should adopt those are such important documents. So I'll modify my motion to say the Traffic Safety Commission requests that the City Council approve a preliminary work plan as follows. Establish standards for level of service analysis conducted by and for the city with the following objective. Review, sorry, I've had so many edits here. Review work by staff, that includes review and public review, that includes review of work by staff on LOS analysis guidance documents. So effectively just bullet point 1 on the list, none of the preamble. So we're just requesting that, so we get our work plan started as a preliminary work plan until we can develop the full one. But that first item on our work plan, which should be the first item on our complete work plan, is to start reviewing the documents that go into level of service analysis to advise the city council on them. Not us doing anything, but to advise the city council.
Okay. Do I have a second, or do we need to use different language?
Let me, and we're getting good, we're good with the line TSC requests, the following, as part of the work plan, establish level of service analysis, establish standards for level of service analysis. That kind of implies we're establishing standards for level of service analysis, and I don't think we are doing that.
Okay, so the Traffic Safety Commission requests that the City Council approve a preliminary work plan that includes review of work by staff on documents related to level of service analysis. Did I repeat the level of service analysis there? No. How does that sound?
Okay, so do we have a version that you can, somebody else can, no offense, somebody else can repeat it back to me?
Can we just go, TSC requests that the city council approves a preliminary work plan while the full work plan is being developed to review work by staff for the public review and formal approval of LOS analysis guidance documents.
Can I ask a question? So in a work plan, would a review be a normal part of a work plan, do you think?
I'm not sure at this point. I have to, again, I want to consult with the city attorney's office to see if that is within the parameters.
Okay, so, and I hate to keep chopping it, if we left that out, it's very possible that we would actually review it as part of our work plan. That seems logical to me.
It seems logical, again.
Right.
The only reason he's asking is to get it before we have the work plan.
Right.
So,
Well, we have a preliminary work plan according to this motion, right?
right,
And so that could be part of the preliminary work plan.
this is.
That would be the only part of the plan.
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
because
and that's what we're saying.
So
that
if
we're
everybody
asking-
agreed, so if the city attorney agreed at some point that, yeah, you review this, of course, that makes sense. And I think it does.
Well, it's a request to city council, so it's gonna go to city attorney and such anyway. So, I mean,
Good point.
I think the motion, I think
So
that
we're
motion is
just
valid.
asking for a preliminary work.
Well, I just don't
plan
want
to just do this
somebody to
topic.
say, well, that's not in your purview.
They will let us know.
It's up to the city council to decide that, so they can decide that then. And they have said that the Traffic Safety Commission shall be in charge of implementing or advising the city council on implementation of mobility elements. So that's exactly what this does.
So do you want me to repeat the motion?
Please.
Traffic Safety Commission requests that the city council approve a preliminary work plan while the full work plan is being developed to review work by staff for public review and formal approval of LOS analysis guidance documents. Do I have a second for this motion?
Second.
Please note Commissioner Linky made the motion and second by Commissioner, can't think.
Fowler.
Fowler. Let's go for a vote. Passed unanimously. Okay. Next.
Next.
Which
Is there any?
which agenda am I on? Okay. For some reason, on the minutes that I have in this folder, there's no item 4. For the minutes that I printed out or somewhere, I don't know.
Your traffic engineer comments.